Hello. Welcome to another installment of the Central American Group's podcast, in which experts discuss topics related to doing business in Costa Rica, El Salvador, and the rest of the region.
Today we have Andrew Crawford with us. Andrew is the Trade Commissioner and Director for Texas and the Pacific region of the U.S. for Costa Rican trade promotion agency called Procomer. Andrew, welcome. Could you say a little bit about yourself and your background and then your organization?
Steve, thank you for having me. Thank you for having me. Excited to have this conversation with you. I've been representing the interests of Costa Rica for trade and investment for the last 20 years in different capacities and in different countries. And our main focus is to make sure that we can develop capabilities in the export ecosystem, and in the meantime, make sure that we create adequate policies to bring down foreign direct investments to Costa Rica. So currently I'm appointed in the United States, based in Houston, Texas, and like you said, foreseeing also the Pacific region of the United States.
Okay, to start things off, let's talk a little bit about trade and geopolitics, because that's on a lot of business people's mind in the international realm these days. What can you tell us about Costa Rica and how Costa Rica in particular relates to U.S. supply chains?
Let me try to elaborate a little on that one, Stephen, because I read a fascinating article a few days ago from Shannon K. O'Neill. She's the VP of Studies and Nelson and David Rockefeller Senior Fellow for Latin America Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations. And she came up with great insights in that article, Stephen. And one that fascinated me the most is that China currently processes 85% of the critical minerals that go into high-tech devices around the world, and also boasts 77% of the world's battery manufacturing capacity. And that is going to be linked to electric vehicles. And the other interesting thing that came up, out of that article is that the United States current authorities started to, running an assessment of their supply chains in vital areas. And critical minerals, which is one that I just mentioned, large capacity batteries, semiconductors, and pharmaceuticals are not in the very best position right now in terms of resilient supply chain structures for the United States. And that really tells us that what we've seen after the pandemic in terms of like certain levels of political instability in different regions of the world, a good number of societies and countries not feeling comfortable with what they're seeing, the ship crisis that we have a couple years ago that basically, skyrocketed prices on many of consumer goods. So all these things together kind of like brought the idea to the United States that they really needed to rethink their supply chains. And that is a great takeaway from the article, as we are seeing Costa Rican authorities jumping into a different, let's say, mode for foreign relations, as what they see in the past, a Asian, ecosystem of countries kind of like leading the world, and that we should follow that specific, path, versus like keep having a great relationship with the US, but kind of like following steps to the Asian, region. Right now, I think everybody like pull the brakes and say like it's time to kind of rethink if the idea of heading to Asia in terms of foreign trade was the main core of our trade development in the future, and kind of like pull the brake and say like, hey, it's time to get back into a very good position with the United States in terms of critical industries and a relationship that we can build out of the capacities that Costa Rica has going on, Stephen.
One of the things that I want to bring up, because it's very important what you were saying about rare earth minerals. And I happened to read a couple of weeks ago an article in the, believe it or not, the Cowboy State Daily, which
Okay.
which is the Wyoming newspaper.
Okay.
And according to this publication, um, there's been a discovery of rare earth minerals in Wyoming near a place called Wheatland that could, in fact, make the United States the world's largest producer. So maybe that problem can be solved domestically. According to what I read, the discovery is 2.34 billion metric tons. So
Yes.
just to put that in there as something we should keep in mind in terms of rare earth minerals and our access to them. We may have greater access to them in the future because of this particular find. But
That is a great thing to address, and that kind of complements the role um, closer locations can play for the U.S. And we know this process for transforming minerals into useful, middle to, intermediate goods. It takes some time, and the combination of efforts that the United States can do from their local capacities and closer allies can be definitely a game changer in the long run, Stephen.
okay, you mentioned a little bit about Costa Rica and how it relates to U.S. supply chains. In a broader perspective, uh, what opportunities do you see for Latin America as a whole?
Well, uh, I just have the idea that in the past, United States saw Latin America as a um, place in which they could have, a lot of business going on, but not worrying about like critical industries from the perspective of having a region that could be a place for working along with this type of approach of economies of scale. Right now, I think the conversation is getting into this direction. Um, Latin America is not extremely close to United States, let's say, but it's not that far either, and that creates or limits the problems that we have with long distance logistics, which is part of the situation that we've seen with Asia. So right now you have in most countries political stability. Right now you have economic growth in most of them. I was checking economic growth of Latin America yesterday, by the way. Most of the economies at least grew 1%, Stephen. Even Venezuela, with all their constraints, they grew 3% last year. Only Argentina and I think it was Haiti, and let's say the whole region itself did not have positive figures for growth. So that means that you have a place where there's economic growth, there's a middle class of consumers and a middle class of travelers and workers that are totally open to develop projects, and in contrast to what you get to see in Asia, the limitations for let's say policies on labor protection and aspects like that are kind of like already being revised here in the region, and United States feels even a lot better during the last few years to do business with Latin America, as in many of these cases, uh, countries try to stick into a much more comprehensive policies for um, labor, much more comprehensive policies for having an open book in terms of regulations and provisions and legislation that can apply for investors, and that is kind of giving an opportunity for like rethinking in those countries. Let's not just think U.S. as a partner for trade. Let's think about U.S. as a partner for developing critical and very strategic industries in between, or to bridge in between both areas, United States and Latin America.
You mentioned when we were chatting before we started to record that the U.S. State Department is actively working and speaking to Costa Rica about ways that the two countries can collaborate economically. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, and that really comes a step together with the openness of Costa Rica to kind of like, like I said, pull the brake a little back of what we were thinking in the future for doing business and developing strategies with Asia, and go back, to the core of relationships that have built most of the economic development of Costa Rica, which is our main allied in terms of trade, cooperation, and assuring even our borders in many aspects. So right now, um, after 1 year of lots of conversations and give and goes in terms of how to put this down, Costa Rica became one of those countries, one of the few allies around the world that are entitled to utilize funds of something that we're going to discuss in a few minutes, which is the CHIPS Act, a bill. And the Department of State said, yes, Costa Rica, yes, Panama, yes, Mexico, you are reliable countries. And we are determined to start creating the path to understand in which capacities you can play a role in the semiconductor industry. So by creating this openness from the United States government as considering Costa Rica an ally, we feel the responsibility to move forward. And also, Stephen, for sure, imitate or replicate the successful model that Costa Rica put down for the life sciences sector, which is right now operating plus 120 companies, combining local companies and international companies, a linkaging model for success in which small businesses in Costa Rica connect with the OEMs and act in a very fashion manner for developing also direct exports. A talent strategy and national policy for developing and connecting talent to all these needs. So there's a lot of interesting tools that we put down through the life science case study that Costa Rica has been doing for the last years to say like we kind of can replicate this into a semiconductor plan. So the idea here is do not invent the wheel, but use many of the good things that we already made and adjust to the realities of the semiconductor industry. So this collaboration that is putting down, Steve, right now is giving, just to give you an idea, the CHIPS Act bill is starting with a $50 billion, let's say, package that is coming from US authorities right now. Out of those 50 billion, approximately 500 million can be utilized by US companies or US organizations or institutions related to the semiconductor industry in Latin America. And of those $5 million already, just to give you an example, one university in Arizona last week received the great news that $14 million out of those $50 million are already assigned for them to be utilized for semiconductor policies in Latin America, including Costa Rica, as of this year. So just to give you an idea, the bill is already up and running and is going to start giving a lot of leverage for the next few years.
You mentioned earlier too, when we were chatting before recording, some very, very interesting information in terms of what Intel has done since it began to manufacture again in Costa Rica, which happened, as you told me, just a few years ago. So if you can give a little background about where Intel went and what they've done within the last 4 years and how that's important.
Absolutely. And I think it's a great insight. Intel's been in Costa Rica for more than 2 decades. That's an important thing to address. And those 2 decades have seen a lot of transformations in the Intel operation in Costa Rica, from lots of manufacturing at one point to lots of services at other, to lots of research and development and testing, to a present not so far from the post-pandemic let's say, times to a reconsideration of manufacturing again in Costa Rica on a high level. Why? Well, 60% of microchips and 90% of the most advanced semiconductor chips vital to the United States on a daily communications to defense to manufacturing are basically relying on Taiwan. And from the Intel perspective operation, 75% of their advanced semiconductors were basically manufactured in Thailand 2-3 years ago. Right now, that 75% went down to 50% because right now the operation is 50% Costa Rica, 50% Taiwan. So that means that in a matter of 2-3 years, Intel's been able to bring 25% of their chip production from Taiwan to Costa Rica to, let's say, decrease the level of risk of supply chains. And the other interesting fact is that this is not only the effort that they put down for this particular thing, is because also the next 2 years are going to be pretty active for Intel in Costa Rica. They're going to invest $1.2 billion in different capacities for their facility down there to also, create much more labs, much more spaces for developing innovation, and much more, areas for addressing critical and, important IP and developments for the betterment of the United States security, machines and different components. So with this in mind, we can definitely say that this is a great case to understand how an industry and how a corporation like this bet big time in Costa Rica, and they're paying off pretty well for that, bet and effort during the last decades.
Well, you mentioned prior to talking about semiconductors, you mentioned that Costa Rica has a very well-developed life science and medical device sector. So it's safe to say that Costa Rica, in general terms, has a very advanced manufacturing ecosystem for things that are technologically advanced. That given the case, could you tell us, you mentioned earlier about the Greenfield FDI Performance Index. First of all, what is that index? And secondly, what does it tell us about Costa Rica and its level of development?
Yes, I think this is a great question, and that's a great insight, Stephen, because it gives us a perspective of how reliable the country has become globally for green investments. This Greenfield FDI Performance Index tries to explain, in terms of the size of an economy, what is the amount of investments that they receive in terms of the GDP. So for the case of Costa Rica, during the assessment of 2022-23, received 12.7 times more investment than the expected size of its economy. And let me give you a perspective on this, just to give you an idea. One of the countries that I admire the most all around the world for their development policies is Singapore. And Singapore basically ranked 10 in this index with 4.9 times. Costa Rica basically received 12.7 more influx of investment in terms of the size of its economy. So that means that there's an acceleration in general terms of the level of investments that the country is receiving, as they rank #1 in this index if you compare it to other countries in terms of the size of the economy, which is important to highlight. I'm not talking about huge economies. I'm talking about economies that are basically receiving a lot of investments in terms of the size of their economy. And that's where you see that we are performing pretty well. And we see, and maybe, Stephen, the daily or weekly announcements of investments in the pharmaceutical medical industry. Let me just quick cases. Bayer, $200 million. Johnson & Johnson announcing a few weeks ago an investment of plus 300 million for the next 5 years. Swedish companies, the Danish companies, 20 million here, 15 million there. So those are the announcements that you get mostly every week of investments that are just going down there. And that's why we are tying up this with the component of talent, Steve, which is very important. We created a national public policy for making sure that the talent will be able to meet all these future and midterm demands for qualified human resource. And my agency, Procomer, operates a department that is also tied up to talent development and bridge with the different investors and companies interested to settle down to make sure that they understand the role and the level of involvement that we get into whenever there's a decision for investing in Costa Rica, and how we're gonna support the talent development process as well for these companies that establish a greenfield operation down there.
In terms of looking at Costa Rica, obviously it's a place that has been very successful, especially considering its size in terms of attracting foreign direct investment. You've got an impressive sector, again, in the medical device and life science industry. Things will develop further than Intel in terms of semiconductor. What, in terms of incentives, does Costa Rica offer to companies that work in these realms that they can take advantage of to situate themselves in your country?
Yes, that's something that we can combine, Steve. Let's say with it's not going to apply for everyone, but since we're talking about semiconductors, let's create a scenario where a company can basically apply for funds at the CHIPS Act bill to transfer operations to Costa Rica, which is very important to highlight too, Stephen. It's not only manufacturing. If you are related to the semiconductor industry in any of the 25 subsectors on the industry, including software development, or a company of semiconductors that would like to move out from a location overseas, their GIS centers or their supply chain offices or their shared services offices, that can be applied to the CHIPS Act bill as well. So it's not only manufacturing itself, it's a lot of different ways in which you can get advantage of the CHIPS Act bill. So let's say you can apply for that purpose, and in the meantime, you can apply for join the free zone model in Costa Rica, the Zona Franca model, the free zone. The free zone is a model that has compliance with the World Trade Organization in terms of the incentives that you're entitled to receive. And we have break it down in two different regions. One is the metro area region, and the other one is the let's say out of the metro area region. And you will have some variations of the incentives in terms of where you settle down your operation, but in general aspects and in general levels of let's say percentages in quantity units, you're gonna get rid of your income tax for a number of years. You're going to get rid of any withholding tax for a number of years whenever you are basically transferring your income to your headquarters, for example. There will be any local government tax apply to any of your activities for a certain period of time. All the value added tax that has to be paid, a 13% value added tax that has to be paid for buying goods locally or for importing assets or goods internationally will be exempt, as well as the custom taxes involved in any of those operations. If you buy property and let's say you won't pay the transfer tax for that property with some, provisions that we have for the purpose itself, depending on certain levels of, of the investment in that particular. And you can also, let's say, get some provisions on the Social Security rates if you get to operate out of the metropolitan area. for example. So instead of paying certain amount of Social Security for the employees, the less developed areas will entitle you to pay a lot less to Social Security as a way to incentivize the possibility of doing business down there. And when I say out of the metro area, Costa Rica is a small country. I mean, you call the metro area a place, let's say the ground zero zone, and you drive a 1 hour, and then you are out of the metro area already, Stephen. So is a very convenient, scenario for those who would like to combine the incentives that we already apply to the CHIPS Act bill, for example. And on the other hand, the free zone model applies for goods and applies for services too. So you get medical devices, you get semiconductor companies, but you also get delivery centers, IT, software development, AI, architectural engineering services. So a lot of stuff can be combined and can be entitled for incentives by applying to the free zone. We call it in Spanish zona franca. We can call it like that, Stephen.
One of the things that I want to point out to people, and this is all second nature to you, obviously, but when Andrew refers to the metropolitan area and the non-metropolitan area, the metro area, in terms of what Costa Rica is the area around San Jose and its environs.
San Jose and its vicinity, which is three more provinces: Heredia, Alajuela, and Cartago. Those are the four provinces that encompass the metro area, and the other three, which are coastal provinces, encompass the out of the metro. But there's some other areas, Stephen, that are close by with lots of proximity to Alajuela and vicinity, that are considered also out of the metro area. So the concept of metro area, it really has to be assessed by the case-by-case interest of a company. So we can kind of like lay it out on a map how that looks like in terms of, distances and connections. But the interesting fact that we have is that, most of the critical components or medical devices or advanced manufacturing components are flown out. And most of the time they use night cargo transportation to be the following day in the United States. And in terms of logistics, that facilitates a lot because they don't have to deal with any, let's say, constraints on a traffic on a day, or they don't have to deal with any, potential, which is very limited in Costa Rica, a strike or a stop on the street. That's a very limited condition in Costa Rica. So usually logistics is a very easygoing component of your decision making in Costa Rica from the perspective of and experiences that we have seen for many companies. And another interesting thing before I just pass it back to you, Stephen, is the free zone model. You can set the clock back to zero before your incentives get to expire within a period of years, a number of years. If you basically are determined to keep up with the structure that you already have established, you only have to reconsider a new reinvestment, and then the clock will get back to zero, and then you keep up with your incentives that are already going on. So that's a very friendly model, as well as you don't have to consider that once this number of years are gone, then I'm gonna be paying like full taxes on everything. No, if you commit to another investment within a period of time, then you can get back to those incentives. And also the incentives are not right away to be paid up front. For being entitled to that, you can do a promise of investment for estimated time of 3 years, and during those 3 years you're going to be able to comply with your promise of investment, and then everything will be basically going with a great flow with our authorities on the government and the private company that basically is entitled to have these incentives going on.
Before we wrap this up, one thing I just want to circle back to, and we've mentioned it a couple of times during this podcast, that is the CHIPS Act.
Yep.
And for the benefit of those people who may not be aware of what exactly that is, could you just explain for those individuals that that need a background and a little bit of explanation of what the CHIPS Act is.
Yes, the CHIPS Act is actually a part of a package that the United States authorities decided to find a bipartisanship deal right after the pandemic to kind of like relaunch the U.S. economy in many different aspects. So the CHIPS Act is one of the components related to that huge package that it was a bipartisanship that came a couple of years ago, if I'm not wrong. And the CHIPS Act is basically a rethink of the U.S. supply chain model for critical industries, in which United States companies will have a better control of those, let's say, different assets that has given them leadership for many years and will allow them to have a better control of those assets for the future and for the betterment of the United States security. And we live in a world in which, let me mention something very quick here, Steve. Just think about this. We think about machines, robots, weapons, automobiles, airplanes, phones, servers, and telecommunication antennas. Just to give you a number of stuff, household goods, refrigerator, TVs, cameras, phones, everything has semiconductors. Our life is based on semiconductors and critical minerals to create those semiconductors. So if you don't have control of that supply chain at a level that will assure that you will not suffer constraints during your development plans in the future as a country, in futuristic and innovative projects that you have, on board. So the best way is to make sure that you bring those critical components of your supply chain the closest as you can. You cannot put every single thing in one basket. You cannot bring everything to the United States. It will be a lot of risk for lots of different, stakeholders and players in the industry. In any single industry, you don't see any industry having everything in one basket. But bringing those intermediate components and raw materials to closer locations, to friend-shoring locations, if we can put it like that, that will give you a better perspective to assure that your IP, your knowledge, and the transfer of that knowledge to these industries is going to be well kept or better kept. And that's something that the CHIPS Act actually brings, behind doors, which is not only, think about industries to get them closer, is also a futuristic, mindset that has, taken part of the United States. And the interesting fact here, Stephen, is that it is clear from both, main parties in the United States, political parties in the United States, that the semiconductor industry is critical for the assurance and development of the United States, as it should for the next 25, 50, 70 years. So that's a great thing that in the political view is the correct, approach and an answer to a different world that we're facing right now after the pandemic.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in the last, I believe it's 20 minutes or so. How would people that have listened to this podcast who have questions about the content of it or questions about how they can do business in Costa Rica, how would they go about contacting you?
Pretty easy. I'm totally open for direct communication. They can even call me. I'm based in Houston, Texas. My phone number is 832-940-8587. Let me repeat that one, 832-940-8587. And also, they can email me. They can email me to my email, which is acrawford@procomer.com. Let me spell that. ACRAW, F as in Frank, ORD, A Crawford at, and then the word Procomer, P as in Paul, R, O, C as in cat, O, M as in Mary, E as in Edward, R as in Robert.com. acrawford at procomer.com. More than happy to have an extended conversation, Steven.
Okay, thank you for the information. We'll make that accessible by a click for people through a link to your website. We'll have a link to your profile on LinkedIn if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
And we'll have the telephone number right in the transcript section of the podcast so that people can get in touch with you with their questions.
Absolutely.
I want to thank you for speaking with me today. You're always instructive and lending information that's useful and relevant. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the time, Steven, and thank you for having me again.
Thank you for listening. Sign up to receive the Central American Group's quarterly newsletter by visiting www.thecentralamericangroup.com.